Welcome to the Podkey summary of Discover Container Machines from WWDC 2026. There's a pretty interesting shift here in how Linux environments can work on macOS. The big idea is a hybrid setup that gives you the isolation of a virtual machine, but keeps the speed, image format, and day-to-day feel that developers expect from containers. What makes it especially practical is that these environments are stateful. They map cleanly to your Mac user and working directory, and they slot into a workflow where you can edit on macOS, run in Linux, and test back on the host without a bunch of glue code. At the center of this is a container machine model, where each Linux environment runs inside its own lightweight virtual machine. That matters, because it gives you stronger isolation, more like a VM, while still behaving with the quick, disposable instincts people like about containers. And the really useful part is that it uses the same OCI image format. So if you already have something like an Alpine image, you can spin up a full Linux environment from that, without maintaining some separate pile of VM images off to the side. That cuts down on duplication in a very unglamorous but very real way. Fewer formats, fewer repositories, fewer moments where somebody asks, wait, which image are we supposed to use for this? A normal container often feels temporary by design. You stop it, rebuild it, start over, and that's fine, until your actual work starts depending on the environment itself. Here, the machine keeps file system changes across stop and start cycles. So if you install tools, add libraries, tweak configs, or otherwise get the environment into a good state, it stays that way. That makes it much more believable as a real development workspace. You can come back later and pick up where you left off, instead of reassembling the same Linux setup for the fourth time this week. It also makes per-project machines a lot more appealing, because you can isolate dependencies without turning every project boot up into a small personal inconvenience. The reason this doesn't collapse under its own ambition is performance. These virtual machines are described as lightweight with sub-second startup times. That's important, because if a tool says VM but behaves like a coffee break, people stop using it. Fast startup keeps the feedback loop close to what developers expect from container workflows. So the pitch is not just stronger isolation in theory, but isolation that's quick enough to use casually, even project by project. One of the nicest quality of life pieces is the automatic mapping of the macOS username and current working directory when you run commands inside the container machine. So inside Linux, commands like whomi and pwd report the same identity and location you're using on the host. That sounds small until you remember how much friction usually comes from manual volume, mounts, custom user setup, and little scripts just to make the environment feel normal. Here, the Linux shell is meant to feel like an extension of the Mac terminal, which is exactly the kind of thing you appreciate more the less you have to think about it. The workflow example is pretty straightforward and pretty compelling. You can edit source code in Xcode on macOS, run the build and server inside the Linux machine, and then test the result in Safari on the host. No file copying, no awkward handoff, no keeping parallel copies of a project, because the editor lives in one world and the runtime lives in another. That's the sweet spot here. macOS can stay the comfortable desktop environment, while Linux handles the app environment, and the two are close enough together to feel like one workflow instead of a negotiated peace treaty. Each container machine has its own isolated network and its own IP address, which you can list with the CLI. If you want to reach a service from the Mac host, the app inside Linux has to listen on the external interface, and then you connect using that machine IP and port, like port 8080 in a browser. So it's not magical, but it is clear. The environment stays isolated, and host access is still available once the service is bound correctly. The command line experience also sounds intentionally familiar. The tool includes commands like container machine, create, run, and stop, which mirror the usual container workflow. That matters because the easiest tool to adopt is often the one that doesn't make you relearn your hands. And if you set a machine as the default, you don't have to keep naming it on every command, which is a small streamlining detail, but exactly the kind of one you notice during repetitive work. Taken together, This looks like an attempt to make Linux development on macOS feel less like switching environments and more like extending one. Same images, fast startup, persistent state, cleaner mapping, and a workflow that stays in motion. For anybody who's bounced between containers and VMs and wish they could borrow the best parts of both, this is a pretty sensible direction. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.